Right, a quick run through of the topic of youth cultures in school. Now, primarily we're going to be looking at anti-school based subcultures here. Those are the ones that have been principally investigated, and the ones that there's a lot more literature about the reasons behind those groups forming. We'll kick off by going from a Marxist perspective and a study that most people will recognise, which is Paul Willis's Learning to Labour. 12 working class lads in a traditional working class school in the 1970s. What Willis is going to find is that these lads kind of subvert the traditional norms of school, are part of an anti-school subculture, where they are, rude about the other kids who are trying and doing well at school, calling them ear holes, what you might call now nerds or geeks or whatever. But essentially, the purpose behind these studies is suggesting that these lads felt there was no value to education. They would kind of perpetually going to get factory-based jobs, which their fathers, their grandparents had because they were from very, very traditional and working class families and had a longevity there in that working class kind of tradition. So there was no value in education. And essentially, capitalism was an issue here. There's a frustration here with the system because they knew that they didn't need any education because they were going straight into a working class job. And that's kind of the subtext of Paul Willis's book. It's Learning to Labour, How Working Class Lads Get Working Class Jobs. I suppose you could look at this with a positive almost slant, is that the lads were kind of socialising themselves in preparation for the wider world of work when they knew they were going to be with like-minded, similar peers in the workplace when they ended up in eventually a factory job. But that is a situation with Willis's Learning to Labour, Marxist angle on a traditional anti-school subculture. Then you've got Martin Mackingale. Remember, he's one person, not two. Martin Mackingale, who we remember from the crisis of masculinity, this idea of men experiencing an identity crisis. They don't know what it is to be a man anymore because the traditional jobs of the 1970s, the factory job, the miner, the working class man then, those jobs are dying out. They're being replaced. Globalization has led to factories going abroad, the mines are shutting down. And what Mackingale says is this has led men to kind of a crisis because everything, particularly the job market, appears to be feminized because more jobs now require the ability to type, the ability to interact on the phone that were traditionally kind of secretarial jobs. That men are now in this position where they are unaware of what it means to be a man, and we can see one of the groups, the subcultures that he identifies in his study, because he looks at other ones, the real Englishmen, kind of the middle class high achievers, the ordinary boys, the new enterprisers, but the one group that he says emerges is the macho lads, and they are a direct response of this threat, this crisis of masculinity. And consequently, as he said on a number of occasions, this crisis of masculinity kind of manifests itself in aggressive kind of macho behaviours. So that is, Mackingale's perspective on this. Again, you're talking about the most anti-school of the subcultures. But he did identify some other groups within those, groups that were achieving, groups that were working class and actually doing quite well, the middle class groups, and kind of like the business-minded students as well. We move on to look specifically at ethnicity. Now, Tony Sewell, the next two work well. Even in topics of ethnicity, you could use them, but principally they are school-based subcultures. You've got Tony Sewell's study into black boys in school, and what he said is that a smaller percentage, or about 14% or 15% of the students turned into this rebel group, this rebellious black school subculture, where they saw failure as a badge of honour. Where essentially they were responding to poor teacher motivation and overt racism from the teachers, leading to conflict, and they've kind of decided, right, school is not for me, I'm not interested in it, and they were getting their, according to Sewell, they were getting their kind of inspiration maybe for their behaviour, or their role modelling came principally from kind of street culture, and gang lifestyle, like yardie gang values and gang lifestyle out on the street. So Tony Sewell says that there's a good proportion of lads that fall into this category, again as a response, as a resistance to the school values, the teacher motivation and the racism that they are facing in that school. Quite a negative one about the teachers from Tony Sewell's perspective, whereas you've got David Gilbourne's study, which focuses on perhaps the effect of kind of like unconscious bias of the teachers, because essentially in his study shows something reasonably similar, is that the teachers are behaving differently to students of different cultures and different ethnicities, even though they're doing it in kind of an unintentional way. So the teachers do have values of fairness and equality. However, they are still behaving principally in a kind of unconscious bias against certain groups and in favour of certain groups. So Gilbourne would say, for example, Asian lads will be considered maybe more hard-working, but the black lads would be the ones who would be getting into trouble, and the ones where the teachers would perceive conflict and interact with them in quite an aggressive way. And obviously this would lead to them getting worse results, but also in more direct conflict with the teacher when perhaps it was unnecessary, even though the teachers were still holding what they believed to be, core values of fairness. They were still teaching and behaving in almost an ethnocentric manner, but promoting certain ethnicities and dealing with them in a different way to other ethnicities. So Gilbourne would be supportive of kind of Sewell's argument that there was a racism in there, but it's a little bit more unconscious than he would say. It's almost unintentional in this situation. Now we go to a group that you will have looked at in feminism, hopefully. It's Caroline Jackson's emergence of the Ladets. So again, this is now a female subculture existing who want to challenge the traditional gender roles, the traditional gender norms, maybe the patriarchal gender norms, resistant to that. This idea that girls should be, passive in class, not controlling, maybe, they're the ones who are sitting and being reserved. They wanted to challenge that through outwardly, objectionable, aggressive, confrontational behaviour with the teacher. This group Jackson referred to as the Ladets. So this kind of challenge of that kind of those patriarchal norms we saw emerging within that group. However, the groups, some of the ones that she studied were actually quite high achievers and just continued that, but worked harder at home than they did in school. So Jackson's Ladets are a good example of a group resisting the patriarchy. And you've got Emma Reynolds. She also studied girls, but she found that the rebellion was more likely to be in exaggerated femininity or sexuality. So their form of resistance wasn't kind of aggressive and outward and confrontational like the Ladets, but it would be more things like having boyfriends who were a lot older and out of school, like wearing a lot of makeup, short skirts, being more like sexually suggestive in their dress code was their particular form of rebellion. So less likely to be a direct conflict, more using exaggerated femininity. Now, and I think that's a nice one because that balances itself with more popular studies like, Mack and Gale, Clark and the skinheads who look at exaggerated masculinity. And most of this we're talking about kind of exaggerated masculine behaviours in the macho lads, in the rebellious boys, but now we've got some exaggerated femininity coming from Reynolds' study. Final one that you can make a broad link to as well, coming from a functionalist perspective, is Albert Cohen and his idea of status frustration. I think we've talked about Albert Cohen a few times. He'll be in a number of different videos, the functionalist video, for example. He'll be in the class-based video, and he also makes it in for school as well, because the idea of status frustration, that these working class lads start to underachieve, start to do badly compared to the middle class lads, begins in school, where they realise that their idea and their belief and their value that in the future they'll be getting a meaningful job, a middle class job, which requires good qualifications, which they want originally, is not going to kind of materialise. So in that sense, at the very beginning of their educational career, there is a consensus of, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to do well at school, but they realise very quickly that the school system is maybe not shaped perfectly for them and fits the more middle class lads and their upbringing. Consequently, when they do worse compared to them, it's looking for ways to boost the status which has been lost, and it's delinquent, antisocial behaviour in their working class peer group outside of school. So although it's not school directly where we're seeing antisocial behaviour for Cohen, it does emerge from school. So there would be a way of applying it to a question on school. Again, lots of this is useful for class, lots of this is useful for ethnicity, lots of this is useful for deviance and delinquency. So very, very useful topic to throw into any other questions as well. And you'll see a lot of overlap here in some of the other areas, such as the Ladets, such as status frustration, such as Willis that we've looked at before on the other topics.